Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I am going to do a few brief introductions and then we'll get on to our primary event for the day. So I just wanted to thank you all for being here to join us for Pace, Money, Race, Gender in the Time of COVID, looking at the digital humanities, an interview with Dr. Moya Bailey, moderated by Dr. Stacy Takacs. I'm Jennifer Borland, and I am the director of the Digital Humanities Initiative here at OSU, and I also teach art history in the Department of Art, Graphic Design, and Art History. And I wanted to just mention a couple of quick things about the Digital Humanities Initiative, which is the sponsoring entity for our event today. So I'm going to pull up. Oh, that's the wrong screen. Let's see. Give me 1 sec here. Make sure I have the. Actually, that's fine. Okay, share that and then get my page up here. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of our website for the Digital Humanities Initiative. You can find information about our events here. You can look at our calendar or also our past events. So if you are eventually hoping to see the video or share the video of this event with everyone, you can do that here. It will be listed with a link by the event that you're looking for. And I also wanted to mention that we have a fairly new Digital Studies certificate oriented for undergraduate students, and information can be found here for that as well. So any of these things you can find on this website. Also, you can certainly go to the About and find contact info if you want to follow up with me after the event, or if you are interested in getting added to our email list or any of those kinds of things. So I am really thrilled that we can welcome our speakers today. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Moya Bailey to you all. Dr. Bailey is Assistant Professor of Africana Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Northeastern University. Her work focuses on marginalized groups' use of digital media to promote social justice as acts of self-affirmation and health promotion, and how race, gender, and sexuality are represented in media and medicine. She is a co-author of #Activism, Networks of Race and Gender Justice with Sarah J. Jackson and Brooke Foucault-Wells, and that was published with MIT Press in 2020. And she is the author of the forthcoming book, Misogynoir Transformed, Black Women's Digital Resistance, and that is coming out in May of this year from New York University Press. Dr. Bailey currently curates the #TransformDH Tumblr initiative in digital humanities and is the digital alchemist for the Octavia E. Butler Legacy Network. And this year, in 2021, she is an MLK Visiting Scholar at MIT. So today, Dr. Bailey will be interviewed by Dr. Stacy Takacs, who is Professor of American Studies and Screen Studies here at Oklahoma State University. And Dr. Takacs has been central to the development of the digital humanities courses that we have here at OSU, and is also involved in our new undergraduate certificate in digital studies. And she's currently teaching a course, Introduction to the Digital Humanities. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Takacs. Thank you again, everyone, for being with us today. And as I said, we'll leave some time for questions at the end, so you may post them at any time during the talk in the Q&A box. And I have left the chat open as well, but try to put your questions in the Q&A. Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jen. Dr. Bailey, welcome to Oklahoma State. I wish we could show you around. It's a winter wonderland, I hear. I actually am not there. I wouldn't know. It's a pleasure to have you here and to have you talk about your work. We've been reading some of your work in the Digital Humanities class this semester, so some of my students are out there and I hope they have questions. They're also supposed to be tweeting this on a back channel. One of the first readings that we had in the class was actually an early piece of yours called All the Digital Humanists Are White, all the nerds are male, but some of us are brave. And in that piece, you advocate for a kind of a transformation of the way that we think about digital humanities. And so I'm wondering if you could start by telling us what you think counts as digital humanities and whether the field has actually risen to meet you at this point, or are we still seeing some of the problems that you diagnosed in that piece?
Oh, thank you so much for the question. And thank you both for having me here and Mick for doing the logistical work for us to be together. I am joining you all from land traditionally stewarded by the Cherokee, Choctaw, and also the Seminole. It was part of the Trail of Tears, so I'm actually not too far from Oklahoma in terms of where I'm located now. And one of the reasons I raise that is I am always thinking about how the digital can obscure different groups and keep us from paying attention to some of the social justice issues that are important to me. And for our conversation today and thinking about that piece, one of the reasons I wrote it was I was part of a collective of people called #TransformDH. We were thinking about what does it mean for the digital humanities to make connections and do the work of digital humanities, but not be as attentive to questions of social justice. So we really wanted to see the field pay more attention to some of these larger questions about how digital humanities projects can actually have some real impact and import on the lives of people who we cared about. And one of the things we saw in those early days, and hence the title of the piece, was that many of the folks who were at the center of capital DH were largely white men and people who had a real interest in big data and questions that had a lot to do with computation. And there wasn't as much interest in the humanities side, at least as we saw it. And not even necessarily that people had to be different, doing different work, but just to acknowledge the way that their own subject position might inform the kind of research they were interested in doing. So in those early days of DH, we had this phrase and framing of hack versus yak. And so there was this idea of, the real DHers were the hackers, the people who were trying to make something, build something, code something, use these digital tools to do work. And then there were other people who were yackers, who were just talking about things, but not necessarily doing anything. And that divide was, I think, more overstated than real, but it definitely reflected a divide along sort of methodological ideas of what digital humanities is, and then also a divide in terms of who was doing that work, who was doing that labor. And you found that the critical questions were often coming from people of color, queer people, people in disability studies who are trying to ask digital humanities to be a bit more reflective on what its goals were. So I would say now we're in a very different era. There doesn't seem to be this big tent DH anymore. It seems like we've all kind of gone into little nodes. We all have our own university digital humanities initiatives. And the things that used to unite us, and one of those that I think of that I'm so sad has not stayed alive very much, are that camps, these technology humanities camps that really kind of connected people at different institutions who are doing different digital humanities work. So in my sense of things, there's a lot of DH that's happening, but it's not as linked or as networked as it used to be. And that is both a gift and a curse because it makes room for lots of different kinds of digital humanities projects. I don't think you can say capital DH anymore. with that sort of assurity that was there in those early days. But it means that the work that people are doing is very particular to their own place and space, which is, again, not necessarily a problem, but it's hard to tell what people are doing and how these questions of race, gender, sexuality, ability are coming up in all of the DH projects that are around right now.
Sorry, having trouble with the mute. Yeah, I mean, my sense is that there's a lot more work on these issues. But then you see things like, I'm an American Studies scholar, so American Quarterly started a digital project segment with their journal. And we saw the capital DH coders being tapped to head that initiative. But, you know, I think appropriately an immediate backlash about the decision-making involved in that. And I think now, a more equitable distribution of both the labor involved in that, but also of the kinds of projects that they're focusing on, types of reviews that they're doing, and the networks that they're tapping into. So, yeah. So one of your other texts is hashtag activism, and that's something we've been reading in the class as well. I've read the entire book. I just assigned a couple chapters for my students, and I found it a really impressive volume. So I'm wondering if you could just tell us really quickly, what is hashtag activism? And, you know, how do you use a hashtag to connect communities and stake political claims?
Yeah, writing this text was really one of the highlights of one of the really wonderful things about being at Northeastern is that there are connections to faculty across different areas. So when we started thinking about this book, I was part of a writing collective of junior faculty who were feminists. So it was a junior feminist faculty writing group, and we actually write on site, and we take a moment at the end of our writing time to talk about what we were working on. And I was working on I was working on an article about Janet Mott's hashtag Girls Like Us. And Sarah J. Jackson and Brooke Foucault-Wells had already been working together on the hashtag MyNYPD. And just in conversations with each other, we realized that there was some overlap in terms of the questions we wanted to ask about the work these hashtags were doing in the world. And so that's when we started to think about hashtag activism. And so for us, hashtag activism is the way that people use Twitter hashtags to enable and move movements. It's a tool that can be used to aid on the ground organizing and also be its own organizing online. And so when we were looking at these two hashtags, we started to think more broadly, like, oh, we should really consider the way this is happening across different groups, how different race and gender justice organizing has been enabled and able to use hashtags to create more activism and more conversations about what people are already doing on the ground. And so in the process of doing that, we came on the idea of doing this book, hashtag activism. And I found it just refreshing to see the way people who didn't necessarily consider themselves activists really mobilize and utilize Twitter in this way that, of course, the creators of Twitter never imagined. And so people took this tool that had been a relic a little bit from listservs, right, of using hashtags, and brought that over to Twitter, and then were able to use it in this new way to actually connect conversations that people perhaps wouldn't have been able to connect to before. And the material impact of that is really impressive. And one of my favorite stories from the text is actually from the foreword by Jeannie Lauren, who did not consider herself an activist, did not see herself as a political person, but following George Zimmerman's acquittal, heard that one of the jurors from the case was maybe going to get a book deal and thought that was really unfair and just didn't sit right with her. And so she was able to use Twitter and hashtags to launch a conversation that ultimately got the juror's book deal canceled. And that was an incredible moment of changing the conversation in such a short amount of time. I think she was able to accomplish that in 24 hours or less.
Yeah, one of the things I found most impressive about the book is that, I think it's easy to look at the title and think, oh, they're celebrating all this yakking that's going on Twitter. But that's not what the book is doing. I see it doing two things. One is it's talking about the way in which Twitter can be used by movements as a communication tool and to help them coordinate their movements, right? But I think more interestingly, from my perspective as a media scholar, the discussion of these groups as counter publics, enacting a kind of counter framing of the mainstream depictions and discourses around these things. Those are the things that I found most generative. Could you speak a little bit about this concept of a counter public and how you see that?
Absolutely. I definitely think that's one of the brilliant pieces of the hashtag Girls Like Us that really attracted me to it. So Girls Like Us, started by Janet Mock, is a hashtag for and by trans women, and initially started out as an activist moment, trying to bring some attention to Jenna Taklova, who was being pushed out of participating in the Miss Universe pageant because the pageant officiants found out that she wasn't assigned female at birth. And so there was this whole backlash towards her, and Janet Mock used the hashtag Girls Like Us to bring some attention to that and get Jenna reinstated in the competition. But the hashtag didn't die after that particular action. It became a space for trans women to have all kinds of important conversations with each other, and even some just basic conversations about what was going on in their lives, things that they hoped for, etc. So it became a real counter narrative to what was happening in mainstream news about trans women, which only seemed to, if it talked about trans women at all, seemed to only be concerned with trans women being murdered and all of the violence that they faced. And that was if it was like doing good work, but often the media portrayed trans women in really degrading and negative light. We think about films and television shows and just a trope of jokes about trans women. And just in this simple act of creating a hashtag, there was a different conversation that was possible, and a community could grow and actually make connections both online and off that could challenge some of those representations. So one other story that I really like about hashtag Girls Like Us is that Jen Richards and Angelica Ross met through the hashtag and were roommates, and then launched the web series Her Story about trans women. And it was actually one of the first projects that was nominated for a Digital Emmy once they started doing that category. And of course, Angelica Ross has gone on to Pose fame and also American Horror Story. Jen Richards is a writer and director doing lots of wonderful work as well. So it just has provided a platform that I don't really think that there's something comparable in kind of mainstream network that is such a wonderful onboarding ramp for people. There's a way that these digital platforms can make people move from the counter public space to moving into a more mainstream public, but they still bring that counter public sensibility. So it's not as if they've had to sacrifice the way they want to be represented. And it gives such a different, nuanced conversation to have someone like Angelica Ross on Pose with Janet Mock directing and writing, etc.
Yeah, I was going to throw that in. And if any of my TV students are here, we'll be getting to Pose. We're gonna talk about it a lot actually later in the semester. But Janet Mock is writer and director on that show and has a major role in that as well. So yeah, parlaying this their status as a counter public into some public exposure and really changing the discourse in that public sphere by doing so. I think really, really important consequence of this kind of activism, right? We're not just talking about people yakking into space.
Absolutely.
Real material consequences. And yeah. So in terms of the design of the book, I was really interested in, because, there are thousands of hashtag campaigns that you might have followed. There are millions of tweets, billions of tweets probably at this point. I'm wondering a little bit about the mechanics of actually building boundaries so that you have a manageable project. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, and that you hit on one of our biggest challenges when we started writing. What do we include? What makes the cut? And how are we organizing this? And we did have for how we started the text, we did have, these central hashtags, Girls Like Us, My NYPD to start with. And we kind of worked around or backwards from them in terms of what are the co-occurring hashtags that we see in relationship to those, and how do those co-occurring hashtags tell us a little bit more about what people are concerned with and what are the other counterpublics that are important. And so what you'll see is that a lot of our co-occurring hashtags follow that race and gender justice model. So we saw, of course, Black Lives Matter. We saw the names of a lot of young Black people who were killed by the police. Also, young Black people, young Black trans people who were killed. So that gave us a sense of kind of where are people having these conversations and what is it that they're connecting between this hashtag that we're interested in and other social justice issues that are concerns for them as well. So it was that gave us a bit of a sense of what's the terrain and what is the range of issues that people are concerned with. And then we started to do something where we wanted to be clear that as we were collecting these tweets, we did not want to replicate any of the violence that we had seen by academics and journalists who just take tweets and use them as they see fit. So a pretty ambitious undertaking given the number of tweets we used is we actually reached out to every person whose handle we used that was not a celebrity or a blue check. And this is also before blue check really started working in the way that it does for the hashtags that were public. And our collection time period also was such that some of the Twitter accounts that we were examining and perhaps wanted to use were no longer active, and people had deleted their accounts. And so if that was the case, we just didn't use the tweet at all. So we really tried to move in a way that allowed Twitter users as much knowledge up front about what it is that we were trying to do and trying to mitigate any potential harm that the aggregation of all of these tweets in a text might inflict on someone unintentionally. And this was a lesson we learned from some of the people that we highlight in the text itself who had their tweets plagiarized by academics or found their work in a BuzzFeed listicle, and it brought millions of people to their timeline who they did not want there and who were very hostile towards them. So it was an opportunity for us to use some of the things we had learned from the Twitter users themselves to make sure that the experience of having their words included was not a negative one. And something we say, and something that was possible because of my own early adoption of Twitter, was that I had a relationship with Janet Mock from Twitter and was able to say, hey, we're working on this book. We're really excited about the hashtag. What do you think about us researching it? And what kind of things would you be interested in knowing about how the hashtag is used? And that was something she really welcomed and was excited to be asked and included in terms of what might be of interest to her in terms of how the hashtag has been moving and how it has been taken up by people.
Yeah, I think that's one of the admirable qualities of the book, because it can be very easy to think, well, people know this is public, they put it on Twitter, and to not do due diligence as a result of that. But the way that you all respected the autonomy of the subjects that you were working with, I thought was really admirable. And certainly a model to be emulated for people who are doing social media research. It can cause harm to quote a tweet, even though someone put it online and knows kind of in the back of their head it's public, doesn't mean they're ready for all of the follow-up that might occur because it goes to a wider circle, right? So yeah, I really admire that part of the book a lot. And that kind of is a nice segue into my next question, which is, your book and your co-authors, you and your co-authors sort of focus on the way that Twitter can be used to nurture marginalized communities who, are, suffering oppressions of various sorts within a mainstream American society that is sexist, racist, homophobic, cisgender, cisnormative, right? But it can also be used now, we know, to nurture marginalized communities on the right who have very different agendas. And I'm wondering if you still are, as positive or if you still feel as positive about the capacity of Twitter to nurture community in this context, in this sort of post-Trump context.
Yeah, and I would add that I don't know that I think those groups are necessarily marginalized on the right. I think they definitely have a much larger platform than I think
That's fair.
imagine they do. Yeah.
We used to be able to say they were on the margin. I'm not sure we can anymore, right?
Exactly. And so one of the things I'll say about the platforms is that the platforms are not neutral, and they also are not designed for the ways that we remake them. So I see people doing this really important work that I've called digital alchemy, like taking these tools and refashioning them, remaking them for tools of social justice. But that is definitely not their intent, and definitely not what they were designed to do, right? As we know, when you don't have to pay for something in this economy, in this world, you are usually the product. So I I think it's one of those little ways that we are taking back a little corner, but I do not assume and did not assume as we were writing the text that Twitter was a panacea or something that would be a way that we could always rely on this particular platform and this particular tactic of using hashtags in a socially just and progressive way. Like most everything, it can be used to foment the kinds of things that we don't want. So for me, in my next text, Misogynoir Transformed, I actually asked some of the Tumblr users that social justice Tumblr users that became friends through my online connection with them, what would an ideal platform look like for them that could actually do this work of changing how we, I mean, really actually promoting social justice, having that at the center. And one of my collaborators on that, Danielle Cole, mentioned that they wanted a platform where it wasn't just users, an understanding of the user and the creator of the platform, that it was a more, or I should say, less hierarchical format in which the people who use the platform also had input on the design and actually got to say, these are the parameters that would be helpful to us for the kinds of things that we want this platform to do. And relatedly, there is an opportunity for people who violate the, rules or the norms that get established within this new platform to be essentially placed in timeout and have the opportunity to learn and grow if they are interested in doing that. And if not, then they get deplatformed, that there's an understanding that there's certain things that won't be tolerated in this space and that that is okay. So I do think that platforms have to do more in terms of setting the tone and what the norms and values of the platform are. This idea that they can just say, oh, we're actually not going to take that on is not, I don't know, it's false. And also it's not really reflective of people's experiences of the platforms themselves.
Well, and it does kind of go back to this concept of a public sphere, because there are, a public sphere is a rule-bound structure, and everyone who enters that space agrees tacitly or explicitly to those rules, and that's what facilitates the exchange of ideas, a rule-governed structure. Yeah, so I agree with you. I think they bear a little more responsibility for establishing the ground rules and then actually enforcing them, which
yes. And what's interesting is that it's often the case that the people who are trying to challenge racist, sexist content get deplatformed or get penalized for bringing that up, because the systems that are set up can't seem to distinguish between someone who is raising the fact that someone else has said some racist content and then the person who is saying the racist content themselves. So it's definitely something that is, I would say, embedded in so many of these platforms. It's really a miracle and an anomaly that people have been able to use these platforms in ways that go against that.
Yeah, and you mentioned in the book there's a case where a Black activist was actually targeted by right-wing groups, and they were using the features of Twitter which allow you to report offensive material, and they were claiming that her feed was offensive, right? So there are ways in which those tools can cut both ways, and not necessarily in an equitable way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Relying on the bots to do the work of determining what's racist language or not is a big problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Since you brought up misogynoir, could you maybe talk a little bit about that concept for us?
Sure. So when I was writing my dissertation, and I do think it's important to say that because sometimes there's been a little bit of revisionist history that's like Dr. Moya Bailey coined misogynoir, and it was not Dr. Moya Bailey at the time. I was a graduate student finishing my dissertation and trying to think through ways that Black women were uniquely denigrated in the material I was looking at, in ways that didn't match the way other women of color were discussed, and definitely not the way that white women were discussed. So there was something, I don't know, sickly synergistic, so like more than the sum of just racism and sexism that was impacting the way Black women were being represented in popular culture and digital culture. And I wanted to come up with some way to talk about that. And so I tried a couple of terms and then landed on misogynoir. And that's what really took off when I joined the Crumb Feminist Collective and wrote a blog post about it. And then Trudy was really an instrumental person in terms of theorizing and spreading the term, because once she saw it from the Crunk Feminist Collective, it really resonated with her. And through her writing and her tweeting about it, it generated a lot more attention. And it's, I don't know, really fascinating to me, this, I don't know, back and forth between the word in academia and the word in popular culture. I did create it as an academic, but it was on this very public facing blog that it got this attention. And then it was a undergraduate student project that made it a Wikipedia entry. And then it's kind of gone back to in people's, I think, you know, trying to be respectful of my title, trying to name it as something generated by an academic faculty person, um, gives it, I think, a little bit more gravitas than it had when I was just a graduate student trying to come up with something that made sense to me and helped explain and frame what I was looking at in my dissertation. So it's a really wild experience of having this word resonate with people, and then also just feeling a little bit just saddened every time it has to be used, because it's not necessarily describing anything that I want to be talking about. But the fact that people find it useful, I think, speaks to the necessity of creating terminology that is specific and really gets to the heart of what it is that we are trying to discuss in our work.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. I think it's circulated so broadly because it is so useful, right? That it is, you know, a really instant way to reframe these issues and these portrayals that we see all over television of particularly young Black girls, but Black women in general, that there's a unique set of stereotypes and derogatory frames for that group. And it's not really, there's not been a language to talk about those intersections.
Absolutely.
So, you know, it provides that language, and I think that's what makes it circulate so well. So I want to leave time for Q&A, so I'm going to kind of jump to my last question, which is actually about the range of your scholarship, because you've written about a number of things. You've written about the institutional barriers to doing activist DH work. You've written about a lot about the pace of DH work. You've been an advocate for slow DH, but of course, the other work you've done on #activism is all about fast, about speed, about the speed of your response and that sort of thing. So I'm wondering, in misogynoir and all of this work, what is a through line? What do you see as a through line between all of these?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I would say The through line for me comes from the Combahee River Collective statement. So, in that statement, written by Black women in the Boston area, actually, in the late 70s, early 80s, they were having a conversation about what it means to do the work of organizing and activism for their communities, and realizing that, as they say it, if Black women were free, it would necessitate the ending of all forms of oppression and thus the liberation of everyone else. And so for me, if we center the people who are most marginalized, and then from there build out our understandings of what social justice work might look like, then I do think that we can create more of the world we want. So the through line for my work is the central question: how do we ensure that Black women get free? And one of the ways that we do that is through thinking about the spaces where Black women find themselves. And one of those spaces is digital space. And it has been a really important tool for Black women's organizing. And another space that I think about is speculative fiction. So Octavia Butler's really imagining new futures and asking the hard questions about humanity itself. I mean, can humans learn and perhaps create another way of interacting with each other? And then also thinking about Black women's survival and health um, in the sphere of medicine and also healthcare. Are there ways and avenues that institution can be challenged and shifted so that some of these embedded biases don't end up enacting the same historical trauma on these groups going forward?
Jen, should we go to Q&A? It seems like we're getting some questions coming in.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you so much to both of you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
There's so much there to talk about. So yeah, I want to open up the Q&A to everyone. Feel free to post questions in the Q&A tab. I'll kind of serve as a moderator for that. But of course, Dr. Takacs, if you want to pop in and follow up on any of those questions. And I have some kind of percolating as well, but I really want to make sure that our attendees have an opportunity to ask some questions. So I think the first one goes back to possibly an earlier point that was made in relation to thinking about, actually, these are both from Hannah, so maybe I can kind of find a way to combine these. I'm going to go with the second question, okay, Hannah? What overlaps do you see happening in hashtag activism between race, gender, and disability? And do you think that these are still largely disparate areas online?
I do not think that these are largely disparate. I do think the question is really one of where you're looking. So when I think of Twitter users that are using uh, hashtags to address gender, race, disability, I think of Alice Wong and her hashtag Crip the Vote. That was instrumental in getting some of the candidates for the first time to actually have a position on disability. She also started the hashtag recently, High Risk CA or High Risk California, that was addressing the fact that um, disabled Californians, high risk Californians, were not getting access to the vaccine because of how the state set up its vaccine distribution. And in all of those, there's a real attention to the way race is informing different disabled people's experiences of disability and of their access to care. I also participated this summer in a session or a series related to the film Crip Camp that appeared on Netflix, the inaugural film of Barack Obama and Michelle Obama's Netflix deal. And that film was so powerful, and the Crip Camp series that resulted from it included the late Stacy Park Milburn and Andrea Levant as organizers and camp leaders who invited all of these different people to talk specifically about the intersection of digital activism, disabled activism, questions of gender, race, etc. And so I would suggest looking at the hashtag CripCamp and also seeing the CripCamp website and some of those webinars that were created for that series that speak to the connections between those. And I think that's also what I'm getting from the first question that you asked, Hannah. Are these hashtags in the same tweets or in the same conversations? I do think they are. That was one of the reasons that we were able to find some of the other hashtags that we look at in the text hashbook activism was through hashtags that were in the same tweet. So seeing hashtag Black Lives Matter paired with hashtag Girls Like Us, or seeing the hashtag Girls Like Us also with hashtag Trayvon Martin. People were making those connections between the violence that trans women experience and the violence that Black people experience at the hands of the police. So I am really excited by the fact that people can create what it is that they need in terms of making these conversations speak to each other in ways that, again, I don't think Twitter could have ever anticipated.
Thank you. I'm just gonna keep cruising through these questions. I know you can see them as well, but the next one is a question about your kind of work as it crosses over with futurist literature, and whether there are trends in that body of literature that can inform how we might be able to move forward more ethically and effectively with DH research.
Oh, that's such a great question, Mary. I'm thinking about something that I've said to people. Have you watched the series Black Mirror? I've said that Black Mirror is a documentary. It's not speculative fiction. And so many of the episodes that have come out have come to fruition. So I'm thinking specifically about the episode Nosedive that is talking about how there is this social capital in the likes and the positive response that you get on social media, that it has real material consequence in what you can do in the world. And people seeing a similar system being set up and actually in place in China in terms of people's social score, giving them access to different parts of the city, and also giving them access to different material goods that other people don't have access to. I think that there is something really important for us to consider in speculative fiction, that it is giving us some semblance of what we should be concerned about. And if our digital humanities scholarship is so presentist that we're not thinking about what might be coming down the pipe, we might miss something. And I was just listening to a talk with Ruha Benjamin and E. Patrick Johnson at Northwestern about, and in the talk, one of the things Dr. Benjamin was saying was that we maybe need to think more about a communication strategy, I would say a digital humanities that isn't always looking at the new shiny thing, that we actually pay attention to what are the bigger questions that our scholarship can speak to that are consistent and give us a sense of what the through line is for humanity going forward, that we don't get distracted by the latest thing, that there needs to be some attention to what we are trying to maintain, and maybe that maintenance is keeping us from being attentive to the potential negative consequences of some of the digital that we might be trying to forward.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of wonderful threads in that response that I would love to follow up on, but I think we should try to get to all the questions that we do have here. So the next question, how do Black and Indigenous people of color alleviate a feeling of guilt when they become tired of becoming the go-to person for a different perspective while continuing to work towards the things that are needed for their communities? So becoming burnt out seems to be a rampant issue nowadays. So if you could address that, thank you.
Yeah, and I would say, Christine, this is an old question. It's a question that I think we're still trying to answer, but one of the places I look to historically for the answer is Toni Cade Bambara's work. And she has a really wonderful poem in The Black Woman that is basically like, it's not revolutionary to neglect yourself for the movement. That's not what we need. There's no need to get burnt out to set yourself on fire to keep others warm, essentially. So I would suggest that you see yourself as part of the communities that you feel responsible to, and that you adopt a practice that if you wouldn't ask someone else to do that, then maybe you shouldn't ask yourself to do that. We've seen so often, and it's still the case, that people of color, I'm thinking of Black women, die early in the academy, die much younger than they should. And there needs to be some way that we are being attentive to that. I am also reminded of the NAP ministry as a really wonderful initiative that's trying to remind people to rest and remind people of color that rest is a revolutionary act. It is important to take care of yourself, and that burnout doesn't serve you or anyone else. So remembering that the guilt is, I don't know, a tool of capitalism to keep you feeling like there's more that you should be doing. There's actually nothing else for you to do but take rest and take care of yourself, especially since we know this is not going to be addressed in our lifetime. We are doing the incremental work that gets us closer and makes it a little bit easier for the generations coming after us. And it doesn't help them for you to get burned up in the process.
Thank you. And I'm also kind of thinking about that in relation to some of your work on slow DH and kind of in general thinking about those questions as they expand to kind of academia as well, and that we all could contribute to creating an environment that allows for that rest for anyone who is in the process of needing it. So that's something that I really appreciate being raised in this conversation. So thank you. We are getting close to the end of our time, but we have another question that is about whether there are folks out there creating the platforms that social justice movements would like to be using? And that was actually a question I had too when you were talking about kind of the thinking about how the users could be involved in the design of new platforms, and whether you knew of any such platforms that were being developed or discussed.
Yes. So one platform that I think of is, and it's a platform that is primarily used by Indigenous communities. And it's, you all might know it. Is it Merkadu? Mukdu? Do you know what I'm talking about? It's a platform that is, and the spelling is different from the way that I'm saying it, which is why I'm unsure about how to pronounce it. But it is designed with communities in mind that have some bit of information that is for one part of the population and not for the other. So it is designed to ensure that, if there's something for the elders in the community, that they have access to it, but it's not accessible by other members of the community until they've been initiated or allowed to kind of cross over into gaining access to that particular information. So I do see those things happening, and it would be really wonderful for people to continue to make the platforms that they need. I do think, even as we were talking about this hack and yak divide, that there is a possibility for um, more conversation of those two things working together, because there needs to be more hacking so that there are opportunities for these platforms to be more readily accessible and available.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to sneak one last question in before we have to wrap up. Could you talk a little bit about the distrust of institutions and how that affects #activism? Are you seeing this distrust directed towards social media providers like Twitter, or are there conversations taking place in other places or even offline to move away from Twitter, perhaps?
Yes, and I think we've seen that with Twitter and with Facebook pushes for people to stop using the different platforms. I'm also thinking about people's move away from WhatsApp to Signal once WhatsApp announced its change in its terms of service agreement. So I do see that happening, but it is the case that these platforms have become so integrated that people don't feel like they can use something else. It's one of people's main ways to communicate. So I think another strategy that people are using is to opt out as much as possible and limit how much they interact with those particular platforms, and are ultimately choosing different ones that work better for them or don't require so much exposure, so much disclosure on the part of the user.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I think we're at the end of our hour, but I really want to say thanks to both of you for being here. And I know some of you are probably aware that we have another session starting at 2:00 that is focused on doing social justice and social media research into social justice, and focused primarily on undergraduate and graduate students here at OSU. So I think some of you we are very likely to see again a little bit later. But I want to thank every single one of you who came, and thank you for your excellent questions. And have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much.